Hello and welcome to the Zach Thinks Your podcast. Today I have Paige Turner, Paige Connell with me, but she's a Paige Turner. You probably know her best as. Paige, I've had the opportunity to get to know you a bit over the past year. I think we talked for the first time maybe a year and a quarter ago-ish.
Yeah.
And I think it was you're probably hitting 50, 60,000 on TikTok, I think, and you're first maybe dipping your feet into Instagram and watching you grow, watching you talk about all the things that you do and realizing how many things you and I think have in common has been really cool. And then realizing that we only live like not even 30 minutes from each other.
Yeah.
I wish I'd taken on the mental load of trying to get us to meet up in person, but there are a couple things that I think you and me were both a part of this year. There was the Will Compton clip that got commented on. You got the lion's share of pushback and lashback from that. And there have been some really interesting things that I've seen you do this year. I want to try to summarize what I think your page, what your goals are, and I want you to tell me where I'm wrong. You occur to me as somebody that is putting out one. I know that you were talking about having this be your full-time career moving forward as you made a shift recently, but you are trying to improve people's understanding of the invisible labor that goes into parenting. You're trying to improve or decrease the gap in between the way women and men are perceived in the marketplace, in the home, in government policies. You are a person that wants to improve the way that we see and or quantify childcare and how we look at it from a policy standpoint, as well as just like a problem that it is, and helping see like the painful financial aspect of it. I know you've been really candid about that and shared a lot of good data that I think a lot of people don't get to see. Uh, and you are the voice. I know you do a lot of emotional labor of pushing back against shitty norms that exist out there of people like the girl dads that are waving their flag of feminism and under while they're showing the flag, they're actually stomping on women at the same time.
Mm.
What am I missing?
I think something I talk a lot about that I think kind of covers all of these areas is just the double standards in the system, right? The double standards and expectations, and how that kind of feeds into every bucket we just talked about, right? The double standards and how we think about childcare as a women's issue, when really it's a family issue, right? And a societal issue and an economic issue. It's not just about women. Same thing about the workplace and gender equity and how there's double standards there, and in parenting and in invisible labor, right? These double standards that exist across all of these things, and how so much of this is systemic. And so I like to talk a lot about how not all of this is an individual issue. We live in a country that thinks a lot about individuals, right? And blames individuals for these issues and all issues, really. But the things that I talk about, that you talk about, a lot of this is systemic, and it's not any one fault typically, until we know better, and then we can do better. And so I talk a lot about that as well.
If you could only choose one topic for the next, I won't push it to the whole year, but if you could, money were taken care of, like you didn't have to do brand deals or anything, and you could
Sure.
just talk about one thing for the next month or two, what do you think would be the thing you would want to move the meter on?
Yeah, I think it's the ways in which we as a society view men and women and the double standards across everything. I think I have been really hung up on this part of it, which is that so much of the way we move through the world is based on how we're viewed by society and what's expected of us. And there is a huge double standard between men and women and what we expect from each other. And I think in parenting specifically, this is really, yeah, it's really evident in parenting, but it's in everything that we do. It's the way we tone police women in the workforce, but we don't do it to men. And so if there was one thing I could talk about all day, every day, it would be these double standards, because I think there are endless examples of it showing up.
And I think I'll bring us to back in, must have been November. There was a clip from this guy Will Compton on his podcast, Bussin' with the Boys. He's a former NFL player, and one of the things that he made a clip out of, which I always think it's funny. I feel like at the stage that, not to sound entitled, but I think whenever I hear viral, I'm thinking if it's not at 5 million, it's not viral anymore. But
I know that
he said
the
that
context of viral varies, right, based on your perceived experience of virality.
The only reason I say that is because so you made a video talking, kind of clapping back at him. He had said, like, I made this viral clip. It was about, he had said, you know what I realized about myself as a dad of our second child is I'm a machine. And then he goes on to list these like really wimpy stats, honestly, of what he felt like he accomplished as his wife had just had a C-section. And I thought you did a really good job. You actually gave him the benefit of the doubt more than he deserved. And I don't think he even gave you credit for, there are a lot of moments where you're like, you know what? Like, I don't know what situation they have at home. Maybe he did do this and this is the information that he gave us. And so like you gave him the benefit of the doubt in a lot of places. And I think it was a longer video because I know you and me were typically stick to 90-ish seconds. And you went on for what, about 3 or 4 minutes or something, which
Yeah.
is, that was part of his thing, was he said that you were yapping, and it had this odd, I don't understand that comedy. I think I understood it as an eighth grader, but not as an adult anymore, of like he decided to make a fart noise as he was playing back some of your video in his response. But what I wanted to talk about here is I think it was a great example of the standard that he felt like he was talking. He felt like he was overperforming, but if you're to put that on the resume of a woman coming out, like, she would be seen as significantly underperforming.
Mm.
What do you think was it? What do you think was, so I know that one of the things that also happened was you got flooded with comments. You got flooded with a lot of hate, a lot of anger. I anticipate most of that was not surprising to you. But at the same time, I wonder with each of these moments, because I know that there's probably a handful every year that come your way. What did you learn out of this interaction with that audience?
Yeah. So I get, you know, respond to videos often on the internet, as we do as content creators. And to be honest, I'll say I didn't know who Will Compton was. I didn't know what podcast this was. This, at least for the context of what I did, was a viral video. So many people had sent me this video. As you probably know, Zach, when you're a content creator, people will send you videos and they'll say, hey, can you respond to this? Can you comment on this? What are your thoughts? And I didn't know who this person was. I just made a response video to the content of the video. And, my response went quote unquote viral, right? It had over 1 million views. People were responding to what I said, and it ended up on his radar. And what was interesting is I've ended up on the radar of men who don't like my message many, many times. I've ended up on Matt Walsh's Twitter feed, right? Like, I am used to having hateful men in my comment section. That is not new to me. What was really interesting about this experience was that they didn't stay in the comment section. They were in my DMs more than not. And I think men do that oftentimes, or people do that on the internet for sake of privacy, right? They don't want to say it publicly on your page, but they want to say it to you anyways, and they're going to tell you how they feel about you. There's also this weird thing where they want to debate you in your comments, or like in your DMs, which was really interesting. That was unique to this one. But what I learned was a lot of these men were in my DMs because they felt the need to defend Will and his character, the man who I responded to, and specifically his brand as being a good dad and a good husband. A lot of them were like, you don't know him. He is such a good dad. He is such a good person. He is such a good partner. If you knew him, you would know that this is a big part of his brand. Like, he cares about his wife. And it was a joke. It was specifically a joke about how he knows he doesn't do nearly as much as his partner. And that was where I paused and I would say, okay, well, is that funny though? That he knows he doesn't do as much as his partner, so he jokes about how his wife is so amazing and how he's so bad. Is that funny though? And what about that makes him a good dad? Why are we qualifying him as a good dad when he's outright saying he doesn't do nearly as much as his partner? Right. And so it was this interesting conversation with people because it again brought to the forefront that double standard that exists, which is like, this guy to these men is a good dad and a good husband. And so many of them had said, you don't know what he's done for me as a father. Like, he's taught me what it looks like to be a good dad. And I found that so interesting because in a lot of the stuff that I receive, it's not about a person. It's not about a brand. It's not about like being a good dad. It's just regular old internet trolling. This was really these men who wanted to go to bat for this guy who they believed was an exemplary person when it came to parenthood, a man that they wanted to emulate when it came to parenthood. And I was a woman saying, whoa, actually, what he's saying is actually not really a great dad in my book. It's a bare minimum dad. And I think that really made a lot of them reflect on themselves. And I say this about the men who actually engaged in conversation with me. There was also like a lot of violent, hateful, harmful messages in my DMs. I don't engage with those, obviously. But the interesting thing about most of these men in my DMs was that they were girl dads. I would go to their page, and Will is a girl dad, self-proclaimed girl dad, wears a girl dad hat. I would go to their page, and it would be a picture of them with their daughters. And I just found it so interesting that they were so comfortable with this man that they viewed as a good man and a good dad attacking a woman on the internet in the way that he did.
Yeah, I thought there were moments I think where I wanted to try to give him the benefit of the doubt because when I saw that he was one of the people that interviewed Trump before the election, I was like, this guy clearly, I think it was Barron Trump that had originally like introduced them, and I thought this person, when I look at the Kelsey brothers, right, they occur to me as some men that have probably the emotional capacity to do a lot of good things on the internet for the state of men, if you will.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that he has a strong following that maybe there's a chance he could be doing some improved messaging. But it wasn't until actually his response on his podcast to your second response, I think it was, that he kind of felt irredeemable to me. And I think it was when he had said, man, Paige didn't know what she was getting into. Like, she didn't know she was stepping in the lion's den. And when I was thinking more about that, I was like, what does that mean? What is the lion's den? It's that she didn't know that she was going to give feedback and have him, when he said, like, I'm not the one. It's like, but if you were a good girl dad, if you were a good dad, if you were a good partner, if you were a good advocate for growth and progression and improvement of men, you would be the one. You would be the one to be able to take feedback and be like, you know what, Paige? Yeah, like, I can totally see that. And like, I aim to be the one, right? When you're saying like these guys are making jokes about it, like, I try to be often the one. I call myself a recovered man child because I know that there's a lot of things that I'm working on that it's not a joke to me when I see that I'm underperforming as a partner. And so I think I know I had talked with you about how I was responding to him, and I tried to really give him the benefit of the doubt. And I think I gave him a lot more room than I should have. And then I made a second video after when I realized, and you helped point me to realize, like, I don't think he's ready for it. I kind of wish you had held him more accountable the way that I think the internet ought to.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think I need to talk about that anymore, but I know that the hate that you get in your comments, in the DMs, is not nearly what I experience. I get a lot of empathy. I think there are a lot of men that probably have fear around confronting another guy, but they have no fear around talking shit to a woman, which is disappointing. There's one guy that I did do a debate with back in August that he pushes back on a lot of my things. And we had a pretty good, like, hour and a half live stream. And I wish there were more guys that were willing to fight me on it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think with the Will thing in particular, a good example is that I reached out to him and he did not respond, but he acknowledged receiving my DM, right? He acknowledged it on his podcast. I didn't listen to it, but you told me about it. I was happy to engage in conversation, right? Like, adult conversation. Will also works for Barstool. So, like, let's just know that Barstool likes to garner attention in whatever way they can and like rage bait. And so it's not surprising that he took what I created and made content. What was surprising was so many men afterwards. And I think this again is indicative of the fact that, like, you and Professor Neil, other people responded to his video, and you have a larger platform than I do. Neil has a larger platform than I do. Yet I was the one that Will came for. And I think the reason Will came for me, it was twofold. One, I'm a woman, and how dare I step into the lion's den of the men and tell them how they could be better. Two, not for nothing, I think it hurt his ego. So many men in my DMs were like, how does it feel for Will to make you famous for all of the wrong reasons? And the funniest thing is, all of my videos on the topic have over 1 million views, and Will's have like 200K or 300K, right? Like, and I'm like, Will's not making me famous. I don't need Will. And I think that's the thing, right? Like, oftentimes men believe that we as women need them to elevate us, need them to validate us, need them to be successful. And they truly thought that this was like my life was ruined by this. There's so many men in my comments like, oh, you'll never live this down. And I'm like, literally, Will Compton is a man that most people don't know. Like, a subset of people know who Will Compton is, but not every man is this powerful being who can just ruin women's lives. But I do think that is how they believe that this is sometimes, right? And so I think, to your point, it's like, in a patriarchy, men believe they have inherent power. And if you come for that power in any sort of way, they feel like they need to put you in your place. I think that's just interesting, right? And when I say I really want to focus on these double standards, I think there is a double standard in how your response video was received versus my response video was received versus how any video you make versus me will be received, right? Like we will always be held to different standards because you as a white man are in a place of power and I as a woman am not. I'm in a place of power compared to other people, right? Because of my privilege, but compared to a man, I'm not. So I just think it's something that I'm encouraging more and more people to do is be really critical of the media you consume. Why is Will considered a good dad? Why am I considered a yapping chick? What is the difference between the two of us? Because if anything, he's a professional yapper. He has a podcast. Like, I don't know. Like, he goes on for hours about football every single week. Like, I would consider that yapping if we we're going to find the term, right? So I just think like these narratives, these words that we use to describe women versus men, like once you start to hear them, it unlocks like this like knowing about what that content's really about.
When I think of the work that you're consistently doing, as much as I think we're fighting the battles day in, day out on social media, I think at the same time you're doing what feels like some pretty important work that I did my first lobbying last year in April for March of Dimes. You went to DC twice last year, and you're doing some of the other hard, boring work that is not like the fun part of getting eyeballs on social media. Could you tell me a little bit about? I know that you said you went down and you fought a little bit against gun violence and looked at advocating for improvement around childcare being available. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if I'm getting that right.
Yes, yeah. So I went to DC in July as an event for the care economy, a conversation at the White House about the care economy. And I do a lot of advocacy around affordable childcare and the childcare crisis, and also how that's tied to lack of paid parental leave. And again, this is all tied to the things I talk about, but these are the systemic issues that we're dealing with that really kind of feed into this inequity that exists between men and women. And so, yes, I was able to go to DC for this broad conversation with legislators and members of the Biden administration to talk about the care economy and the impact of the care economy and the lack of infrastructure that exists. And this was obviously prior to the election. And so there was hopes that certain things would come to fruition, but it really was focused on bringing more awareness and acknowledgement to the issues that people are dealing with. There's the lack of childcare, lack of affordable childcare. There's the lack of care for aging parents and sick loved ones. There's a lack of paid leave to care for sick loved ones, or just in general. There's the sandwich generation. If you're not familiar, it's people who are caring for their children and their parents, right? So there's all of these issues that people are dealing with. And much of it has to do with the fact that there are not supports for families in any way to care for their loved ones when they need care. The majority of us will be a caregiver at some point in our life, and we are going to need these things, whether it's childcare or care for our aging parents or care for a sick loved one. And this was really to advocate for not just financial supports, but social safety nets for families and for people and for everybody's well-being. So that was one thing I did. And then, yes, I was at a lobbying event in DC for March 4th, which is currently working on the Go Safe Act, which is essentially an assault weapons ban of sorts. And really, I do that because as a mother, I can't really understand how we haven't done something to prevent gun violence. And, what I've learned through this work is that assault weapons typically are the weapon of choice because of how much destruction they do. And oftentimes they're purchased within 30 days of the incident. And so this really is meant not to kind of take away people's guns, but to limit the access to people who want to do the most harm. And obviously the most harm is coming to our children. It is the number one killer of children in our country is gun violence. And so as a mom to 4 young kids, I don't know how I couldn't be thinking about this, knowing it's the biggest risks to their life right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I talked to you before we started recording about right now I'm working on catching up to my wife, and she started researching childcare as we just moved. And so we're looking at the next stage we're going into.
Yeah.
We're looking at, some of the prices per year are like a little bit shocking when you look at it in a per year dimension. And then there were a handful of moments when we were looking at what it looks like weekly. And we're going to be spending definitely more than we had before. And I had this moment as I was thinking about, wow, is this this is just what it kind of currently is. And I remember we were looking at reviews on Google, looking at reviews on Facebook, And one of the things that showed up was a really negative review, and it was talking about like a dispute over like a government voucher, I think it was.
Mm,
And I was like, there's vouchers for this? I didn't even know that.
yeah.
And I thought to myself, oh, I know we have some level of privilege. I have no idea what the threshold is for vouchers and or how hard it is to do that. And I remember when
Yeah.
I was going to get my paternity leave signed off back 3 years ago, I remember being glad it wasn't as many hoops to jump through as I thought, but I'm thinking at a minimum, I should be trying to fill out the voucher to find out like whether I qualify or not, and just getting an idea of like what exists out there for support. And I think I can only be an advocate once I know what does and doesn't exist out there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually am very familiar with government vouchers because my two oldest kids were in foster care. And I was their foster mom first and foremost. And when they were in foster care, they received government subsidies for childcare. And so I did not have to like apply for them in the traditional sense, right? They were receiving this because they were under the care of the state at the time, and so they were eligible for these vouchers. But I do believe that they are actually pretty difficult to come by. You really do have to have a pretty low threshold of income to get them. But I think there's this common misconception. So I talk a lot about the cost of childcare, and I talk a lot about the cost of childcare because there's a childcare crisis. And I am somebody who both pays an insane amount of money for childcare. I just did the math; it's over $66,000 a
66,000.
year.
Yeah.
So I have four kids, right? But just for my two youngest kids, it was $38,000. So that's the bulk of it, right? Is daycare costs. And so I talk a lot about this, but not just from the perspective of the fact that it's drowning American families, because it is. It is two kids in full-time daycare is more than people's mortgages in about 45 states, and it's more than rent in all 50 states. So it is the most significant cost for working families right now. And we know that almost every family, the majority of families, are dual income homes. So they are using some form of childcare. And so this is a huge issue for the average American family. But it's also an issue for care workers. And for context, I used to work in daycares. I worked in a daycare for about 8 years, and then I was also a nanny. So I've been in the care worker position as well and know what it's like to work that job, what it's like to work in a corporate center, and what it's like to be a nanny, and all the struggles, because oftentimes people think, like, where's this money going? And it's not going to the care workers. They're typically making minimum wage. And even directors who run some of these centers are making $20 an hour. It's not a lucrative job. It's incredibly demanding, incredibly hard. And so there's this real imbalance, right? It's an industry that is crumbling. It really is. And the pandemic made it even worse. But when we think about vouchers, I did have a woman in my DMs once, and this woman was in a place of privilege, paying very similar to me incredible amounts of money in childcare. And she said, "You're gonna get this. I'm so frustrated because I pay X amount of money every single month for childcare, and there's a family that goes for free. They go here for free. And how is that fair? That's unfair." And I responded to her and said, "Of course it's fair. Every single family in our country, every single child should have access to safe childcare. First and foremost, they should have access to safe childcare, and it should be affordable for them. Everyone. Just because you're wealthy, it does not mean that your kid should have a level of privilege when it comes to the childcare they receive, right? Every child is deserving of the same kind of care." And so it might feel unfair to you because you're paying these astronomical amounts of money, but this family can't afford childcare. Otherwise, they would not qualify for this government subsidy. They would not, right? My children got to go to a nice daycare when they were in foster care, but it's not because they had any level of privilege. They were children who were in foster care, right? These kids deserve
Mm.
childcare just as much as any other child who was there, right? Regardless of their circumstances. So I want us to like take our privilege out of this conversation and remind ourselves that every single family and child deserves this. But the system is broken. And so how do we fix it, right? I believe that we need government subsidies and funding for childcare. I believe that it shouldn't be a privatized industry that is being scooped up by private equity. I think there's so many things that are wrong and broken in the childcare industry. But I also think we need to view care work as valuable work. And this goes back to that double standard, which is we don't believe that care work is the work of everyone. We believe that it's the work of women and that it's not very important work. We don't pay well for it.
Mm.
And when women do it at home, we don't value it, right? We'll say, "Oh, she just stays at home. What is she doing? It's his money," right? It's all of this is tied to that work of caregiving. And so I think it's not only systemic, it's societal, but ultimately without affordable childcare, it causes economic issues as well. This is, it's forcing people out of the workforce. It's making it so people can't afford things outside of paying for their mortgage and daycare, right? They're not spending in the economy. And so this is a huge, huge issue that is tied to so many other things that are going on in our country. But it's something you're going to continue to hear people talk about because the average American family is dealing with this issue.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a unique perspective I got to have the other day. So we have my wife scheduled. I think we have 5 appointments set up for next Monday for looking at
Mm,
childcare. We're bringing our kid with us. Um, as she was doing that, and we're putting together a spreadsheet for the costs of each one, so we could do a little bit of cost analysis, look at
yeah.
the ratings on it, what the hours are that are available. I think it was of the 8 or 9 that we identified, which it seems like there's a fair amount of options in our area. Only 3 or 4 of them had their prices available on the website. Now, for me, as someone that is running business, creating education, coaching for men, I've battled with this quite a bit. Is thinking, do I leave my prices on there and people can just like see what it is
Yeah.
and then go sign up, or do I work like hell to get them on a discovery call where I identify their problems with them and look to see if we're a good fit and then share with them what the price is, because
Yeah.
so many people don't necessarily see the pain that they're currently in to make a financial choice. And I thought to myself, wow, the amount of people that don't like, I'm not in a place where I'm significantly more successful. If I just left my prices on there, I don't think I would have any clients. Like, it takes a discovery call for people to choose that
Yeah.
versus a lot of childcares. You would think you could just look at the prices and people would sign up, but the amount of childcares that require you to come on a tour for you to get their numbers and like have a conversation. I know my wife, she, I think she put in like a Saturday morning application and someone called her like 3 minutes later.
Wow.
Dude, it's like 8 a.m. on a Saturday. Like,
Yeah.
what that tells me is that they are often even hurting for people to come in and pay their tuition, which that was really surprising to me.
So the childcare industry is really interesting because there's so many different parts of it, right? So there's like your nannies and your nanny shares, there's daycares, and within daycares, you've got corporate centers, recreational centers, church centers, home daycare centers, right? There's all these different centers and they all operate differently. There's corporate, and corporate really is about the numbers, as you're talking about. I mean, they're corporations, and some of them are run by a private equity now. And so it's like they are about the bottom line. They are not really about, I mean, they probably didn't get in the business because they love kids, right? If it's a private equity company, they got into the business because they see dollar signs. And so, yeah, you're going to experience that depending on the childcare center that you're looking at. We are actually at a town run center, so it's actually a nonprofit run center, so it's very different. But I've been at corporate centers and I've worked at corporate centers, so I know what that's like. It is really interesting. These companies often are not, like the ones that are not super corporate are not thriving. They're not super profitable. It's not a profitable industry. It's incredibly expensive. It has a ton of overhead, a lot of insurance, all of these things. But that price, just a hack, most states will have an online way of figuring out all of the rates for all of the centers in the state. There are ways to do this. I don't know for every state. Zach, I can probably send you the one that I know for Massachusetts, but where you can go in and you can see their rates ahead of time. A lot of times they don't give you those rates because they want you to come in and see how nice and shiny their center is, or meet the teachers, understand their qualifications, understand if they're Montessori or not Montessori, right? Whatever it might be. But there's also certain things that people don't often know, and if they're just looking at a price, they don't understand the full context of it, which is like, is this one open till 5 and is this one open till 6? Does this one provide
Mm-hmm.
lunch and snacks? Does this one not provide lunch and snacks, right? I'm currently at a less expensive one, but I provide lunch. At my last one, they provided lunch. And actually that did save us money as a family. And like, it didn't save us enough money for us to stay at that corporate center. But
Yeah.
these are all the things that you're thinking about as a parent when you're going into these centers. And so, but at the end of the day, even at the least expensive center, it's still, my sister's at a home daycare in our town. It's still $80 a day. It's not inexpensive. It is incredibly expensive for most families. And yeah, it's just not sustainable right now.
One of the things, I've been reading this book recently with Alyssa, her request, she's been leaning into her intuition more this year. I don't know if you've ever heard of this book, The Gift of Fear, which pretty much tells us that our intuition is actually not as woo-woo as we think it is. It's
Hmm.
that we are able to put together a couple micro pieces of information that are like point A and it just zips all the way to point Z about making a decision. Like, we shouldn't go down that alley. Versus logic tells us, well, we see point A, therefore point B and C, and like, we're not getting to Z until a day later.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things they talk about is that we're so often trying to prove to ourselves that we want something. We're always trying to qualify, and we're not honestly doing enough disqualification. And one of the
Mm.
examples was, if you were hiring a babysitter and you ask them, something like, have you ever hurt a child or something? Like, there are some really obvious red flag answers to that question. Like, tell me what you mean by abuse, or like there are some terrible answer responses to that. And then there are some, pretty normal responses to it. So we're thinking about what are the questions that are disqualifying. Do you have any favorite disqualifying questions that you would ask a child
For
care center that
childcare?
you're interviewing? Yeah.
I think it depends on your specific child, their age, their needs, right? So for me, it's also like one of the big ones I think a lot of people ask is like, how do you handle like quote unquote discipline? Like, what does that look like in here? How do you correct unwanted behaviors? That's a helpful conversation to be having. I know like we're in the world of gentle parenting. So like what does that mean for you? How do you, in our home we talk a lot about natural consequences and what does that mean, right? My son threw a toy and it broke yesterday and he's like, I need a new one. I'm like, oh, not dude, this is a natural consequence. Like you just broke this toy. I can't just buy you a new one. That's not how this works, right? And so like talking about those kinds of things with a care provider is really important, especially if you have one-to-one care, it's like, you have a lot more control in that environment. Like if you have a nanny or something, whereas in a daycare, they might have a very specific method, or also like there's regulations on what they can and can't do. Right. And so like understanding those regulations, be knowledgeable about what's required from your state. I think that's also important to know what's going on. But yeah, I think it's so funny. The disqualifying questions is something I think about oftentimes actually in like dating too. I don't know. Like I tell people not to ask like, what do you expect your wife to do? But tell me about your parents. Like, did your mom work? Did your dad work? Like, what was that like? And the way they answer that question and what they tell you about their childhood and what they liked or didn't like is going to tell you a lot about that person. And whether or not you might align or not. I think there's a lot of, in life, we ask these questions in all different ways.
Last question for you, Paige, before you go. I responded, or I made a stitch of a video recently, which was what is your micro act of feminism? Which,
Mm.
looking back on it, I don't know that they're acts of feminism necessarily. I think it makes women's lives better, and I think it would be, like you had said, like pointing out the disparity of like what we think are women's
Mm-hmm.
issues. What is the micro act of equality that
Mm.
you consistently do and you would encourage listeners to engage in? And
I was at, oh, go ahead.
one of the examples I thought was, one of the women is, she had said, I always ask to put whenever they're talking about like the NBA, they're like the men's basketball league
Yeah, yeah,
versus
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
the basketball league.
Yeah. Yeah, I was asked a very similar question by someone, I can't remember, and they were like, "Oh, do you do any micro acts of feminism?" And my response to that was like, "Actually, no. I like to be nice and loud about my expectations, and I don't like to be subtle about it. I don't like to say like, "Oh, can I see the doctor? Is she in?" Like, yes, of course I'm going to do that. I'm going to do those things. Even like when you're playing with your kids, like how do we gender things? Why do we gender things a certain way, right? Like all those things are like small acts, but I just think that's just being conscious of gender equity. I think when I think about like my day-to-day life, and you probably know this, in the world who consumes my content knows this, like I'd rather be nice and loud about it. I would rather say to my friend who has a new baby who tells me he never wakes up overnight, I'd rather say, "Why are you not waking up overnight? That's crazy. Like that's your baby." Like I would rather just say that. I would rather ask my friend why they don't think it's their job to wake up with their baby overnight than say something small that might like, slight like an earworm, right? Like I want to be nice and loud about how I feel about things. And I don't know if that's the right move, but for me, that's how I am, because I think these small acts can actually be ignored. And all I think sometimes what they do is they kind of like poke at that ego we were talking about earlier. Like they poke at the ego and they piss people off. But I don't know that they always have the end result that we need. Like I think we do need to be pretty loud about our expectations and very clear about what we're expecting when it comes to equality, because subtleties help. I think they help us feel better, right? As women, it helps change the narrative a little bit, which I do think is important. Like the way we consume media, the way that we talk, the genders we use when we're referring to a doctor or not, and assuming it's a man versus a woman. I think those things matter. But I really do think like nothing's going to change until we say like in really concrete ways what it looks like to have equality and what we're expecting of people, as opposed to kind of like manifesting it into existence.
So your encouragement to people is to consider that the micro probably isn't doing the poking that we need to it to puncture the giant balloon of patriarchy. And if we want to actually be making a difference, you highly encourage being a little bit louder and almost righteous doesn't, I don't like this word, but almost being like a little bit righteous, a little bit like empowered in, yeah, I'm going to be louder, but like we're going to put a dent in this rather than trying to poke it with our pinky.
Yeah, and I think like know your audience, right? Like microfeminisms, things like that. Like those are great for like a crowd you don't know, people you don't know, environments maybe where you're not super comfortable. But I think like in our day-to-day lives with your brother or your dad or your friend's husband or your friend, right? Like in these conversations where we feel like we can be a little bit more open and they know who we are and we know who they are. There's some trust and good intent there. It's better to be a little bit louder, right? Maybe in an email to a stranger on the internet, like you can drop that microfeminism, right? I think there's a place for both. I think both matter. I just tend to partake more in the macro version than the micro.
Yeah, I think that takes a lot of courage for a lot of people to do, and I'm grateful that you have found the courage. That it occurs to me that doesn't take the amount of courage that maybe it used to for you because you've gotten so used to it.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think that poking fun at my own self for the value of other people to see their own imperfections. It's gotten a lot easier for me. That it was really scary, 2.5 years ago, but it's not
Yeah.
nearly the same today.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a
Paige,
muscle.
thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to sharing this with people. I'm imagining the main place people would want to be finding you is on Instagram. She's a Paige Turner. TikTok. She's a Paige Turner.
Yes.
Your podcast with Abby would be the next place I'm imagining.
Yeah, you can find me. Also, I have a Substack at She's a Paige Turner. At She's a Paige Turner, pretty much everywhere: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and then yes, I have a content series with Abby Eckel. It's called On the Same Page with Abby and Paige on YouTube. Yeah, and you can find everything linked to my Instagram. That's probably the best place to go.
Thank you, Paige. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.